Currently, Mike is working on a book called The Nature of Mountains, an exploration of ecological and cultural landscapes of the world's great mountain ranges.
Well, cool. Yes. Thank you very much. I stand here as the final object between you and happy hour. That's the good news. Bad news is in Logan, Utah, no such thing as happy hour. Somewhat of an ambitious title to our talk here, and it's maybe slightly different than what's in the program, but traveling around has kind of broadened my perspective. I want to put context on the topic of bristlecone pines and sky islands within the context of pines as they occur around the whole Arctic ecozone. So, and it also forms an umbrella over my Ag Station project, those of you at USU, that has kind of framed what we do over the last maybe, I hate to say decades, but yes, decades. And currently working on this aspect of it, the bristlecone pines, with my main collaborator here recently, Justin Runyon. He's a research entomologist up at the Rocky Mountain Station in Bozeman. Our PhD student, Curtis Gray. I hope you got to see his poster. And our technician, Andrew Ginta. So I've been increasingly interested in the Alpine tree line as I've traveled around for this book. And here these points represent places where I traveled to look at the tree line and make observations. And just briefly, we have this group of species here, the kind of Antarctic flora that evolved in Gondwana as Pangaea split up and the remnants of that, continents, South America, Antarctica, Oceania, and characterized by vegetation that's largely represented by Notophagus, the southern beech. So that's these at the southern extreme, lower elevations, Tierra del Fuego, Patagonia, not Antarctica obviously, but there are fossils of Notophagus on Antarctica. To the far northern latitudes, in which we have kind of the boreal forest, the white spruce, and paper birch being common components of that. And up in here, these are lower latitude forests of the Himalayas, in which Abies and Tsuga, these are fir and hemlock, are significant species, along with Betula utilis. And then as well, interestingly, I thought the tree that has the highest, grows to the highest alpine tree line in the world is in fact a juniper, Juniperus tibetica, the Tibetan juniper, which grows, although I never got to its highest point, it grows to up to 5,500 meters, kind of in the eastern Himalaya near China, Myanmar, kind of over there. But there's this group of trees that we're most interested in the present context, and they occupy this rather narrow range of latitudes, kind of 40 to 55 in that circle there, but a fairly large range of elevations. If you look at Pinus pumila, you can see that it grows to a tree line, an alpine tree line of less than 1,000 meters, versus Pinus longiva, the main player in this discussion, that grows to the highest tree line up around 3,600 meters in Nevada. And within the circle are the species familiar to those of us that work in the West. These are the spruce, fir, and the high elevation five-needle pines, which are of particular interest in that they stretch across the whole Arctic. So if you can picture, going back again to Pangaea a year or two back, and the migration of Laurasia north, and the time at which Asia, Europe, and North America were essentially connected. And so there was a dispersion east and west of conifer species 1 to 200 million years ago, in which conifers were the dominant vegetation at the time. Then it became a period where there was an evolution of the angiosperms, which are much more competitive with the conifers. Conifers became extinct. Climate change, the periods of mountain building, both tectonic and volcanism, and the conifers, the forerunners of the pines, began to migrate upslope into these refugia. And so the present status and distribution of high elevation species, especially pines, is a result of climate-driven episodes of migration and isolation and recolonization in response to changing climates during the late Neocene, and then especially important during the Pleistocene, the glacial stage, maybe 2.5 million years ago through 15,000 years ago, a shared glacial history amongst these species. So we'll take a little tour, starting in Japan, looking at some of these species and moving westward to zero in to Great Basin bristlecone pine. So here's the Siberian dwarf pine, Pinus pumila, growing on a mountain called Mount Apoy on the island of Hokkaido, only 1,000 meters in elevation, so right away brings into question the utility of elevation per se as a definition of the alpine tree line, because that's relatively low. If you were to ski the fall line here, I mean, being in Utah, we'll visualize skiing the fall line here, going to your right. In 800 meters, you'd go splash into the West Pacific Ocean. So this particular mountain comes right out of the Pacific Ocean, but it has a climate that is typical of alpine tree lines that occur at 5,500 meters in the Himalayas. And in this case, it's forced the tree to grow in a form that allows it to protect its vital organs, shall we say, especially meristems and roots. But it keeps itself out of the wind, out of the radiation, allows itself to be buried under deep snow. That place between the snow and the earth is as warm as it gets at tree line. So this kind of prostate form is not uncommon. Pinus pumila has taken it to be the form that I saw it everywhere I looked at it. Korean stone pine grows in Nagano, kind of the western part of Japan, into Korea, North Korea, parts of China, obviously I didn't go to, but in Korea, kind of a more typical forest tree. Siberian stone pine, this picture taken from Siberia, kind of looking south into Mongolia, the Eurasian steppe, the Gobi Desert, the plateau of Tibet, and the Himalayas beyond. So very far north, almost into the boreal, the north temperate forest is Siberian stone pine. Himalayan pine, I came to view this more similar to our mid-elevation five-needle pine. So sugar pine, western white pine, eastern white pine, some of those more than a high elevation pine. It grows throughout the south slope of the Himalayas from the Hindu Kush and Karakoram through the Himalayas clear to near Myanmar, but on the south slope. And is a pretty prominent forest tree, more typical of what we see growing often with Himalayan birch, spruce, larch. A couple of Bhutanese chaps that helped me go find what it was I was looking for. Most intrigued by what I was doing, but what the heck, they'll help out. You're doing what? Okay, fine. But what we're doing here is collecting terpene samples that we're using to try to get at some of the phylogeny, because my explanation of the distribution of these trees across Laurasia would cause you to wonder, it caused me to wonder, about the relationships between these. And we've collected samples from all of these species that we will eventually hopefully do some DNA analyses to get at the answers to some of those questions. Really interesting tree, perhaps my favorite, is Pinus Puse, the Macedonia pine. Grows as a tertiary relic in just these two mountain ranges, one in Macedonia, the other in Bulgaria. Very well isolated from any other similar species, and a questionable relationship. It's just not really known what it's closely related to. It's been isolated on these two mountains for a very long time, and if you went south from here in the Balkans, you would be into Greece and the Aegean, Ionian seas, and kind of Mediterranean vegetation. So it's pretty well stuck in much the same way as bristlecone pine is. Probably the most familiar to people that travel a lot would be Swiss stone pine as it grows throughout the Alps, here near Davos, and here as well. And I think you can start to get a sense of one of the themes of this talk, and that is the upward migration of these trees as temperatures warm, and that's sort of visible as these trees move up. You can see the tree line kind of farther down here, and then these isolated individuals that are going up in elevation as it gets warmer, just as they've done, as I pointed out, for millennia, up and down in response to changing climates. The poster child for the western species is the whitebark pine. It was once, and maybe is still considered for T&E status by the Fish and Wildlife Service, would be the only the second tree to achieve such a designation. It's been deferred or withdrawn or whatever the word is, but nonetheless the combined effects of warming climate, bark beetles, fires, blister rust, have all put this particular species in peril, and it tends to lump all the western species together into this group of threatened species, which may or may not be the case, but very heavily impacted by mountain pine beetle, no question about that. And here I visited it where it grows at its farthest north distribution in the Rocky Mountains up in Alberta. And you can also see this kind of glacial basin, the moraine, this picture taken from a lateral moraine, and how a glacier sat in there, and now how the tree is migrating back as this glacier has retreated in the last few thousand years. Some of the more restricted distribution, the foxtail pines of California, parts of Nevada, this in Arizona, the southwestern white pine, Rocky Mountain bristlecone, obviously closely related to Great Basin bristlecone, got separated out by the Rocky Mountains, became separate species. And finally, Great Basin bristlecone pine, which has this pretty wide geographic distribution throughout Nevada, parts of western Utah, into eastern California, but it's limited to these sky islands. So this is where the refuge is in the current climate. And conventional wisdom tells us that these are threatened by the combined effects of the climate change, the bark beetles, white pine blister rust, fragmentation, exploitation, the bioconservation buzzwords. Probably had its best development during the Pleistocene. I think Rick mentioned this morning that I thought I heard him say that both bristlecone pine and limber pine were probably farther distributed out during the early parts of the Pleistocene. That's one of the things that Curtis needs to get at with his dissertation is what was the greatest extent of this, what is its extent now, and how will that change going forward. And I think the fire is most influential here in its effect on lower elevation forests that grade into bristlecone pine. Throughout all of these systems, there are many, many interesting endemic species that exist in the habitat. So throughout the world, you go to these kind of sky island refuges and you find a whole assemblage of plants and animals that exist nowhere else. In the case of Great Basin bristlecone pine, the Mount Charleston pine butterfly may in fact be extinct, last seen in maybe, at least as far as I could tell, around 2009. Grows on this particular plant that occurs only there. And then interesting stories could be told about the Palmer's chipmunk, the olive-sided flycatcher, desert tortoise, or Lahontan cutthroat trout, all endemic species to sky islands in Nevada. So just some pictures of Great Basin bristlecone pine where it grows to give you a flavor of the habitat. It achieves its best development on limestone, here shown in Great Basin National Park where Wheeler Peak is, highest point in Nevada. Obviously pretty rocky sites are typical. And the sky islands, the islands being separated by the greater desert that makes migration between mountain ranges difficult. Probably some of the best stands occur in the Spring Mountains near Las Vegas, of all places. But really good stands of Great Basin bristlecone pine there, as well as, of course, in Great Basin National Park. And this is a map that Curtis developed from the usual sources that kind of show the distribution of the 6, what we consider to be high elevation 5-needle pines in the west, also including limber, which is a little bit more robust and has a wider range, but these are very clearly alpine tree-line species, and our interest is with, these green dots throughout the mountains there. But the distribution map, if you were to tell a modeler like Curtis, find me bristlecone pine out there, well, you'd put in limestone above 3,400 meters, and boom, these dots would appear, So what Curtis is trying to do is develop a landscape cover model that kind of correlates terrain, spectral variables, along with our field verification to hopefully, and I'm looking at you as I say this, Curtis, to hopefully assess the historic range of bristlecone pine. What was the climate like during its maximum distribution? What is it now? And then what would it be like under various climate scenarios going forward? So finally we get to these agents of disturbance that affect conifers throughout the range, things that we sort of study in our group. Beetles, fuels and fire and snow avalanches are kind of the mainstay of my graduate students program over the last many years, actually. Changing temperature becoming more interesting as we've gotten into the Alpine. So we're looking at changing temperature, the mountain pine beetle, fuels and fire, and snow avalanches, kind of the ecological influence of snow avalanches. So there's a guy named Kerner, wrote the book called Alpine Tree Line, sort of the definitive book on the alpine tree line. He wrote the book I wanted to write before I knew that I wanted to write it, And you've all kind of been there. You got a great idea. You realize somebody already described that idea years ago. Kind of hate when that happens. Anyway, it's pretty clear. You can think of all the things that change as you go up in elevation that might put this kind of well-defined limit on where trees grow. It's, boom, pretty abrupt. And you think about what those are, well, temperature comes to mind. But it turns out from Kerner's work, in analyzing the work of others, it's this value that is the temperature 10 centimeters below the soil surface. So this is a soil temperature 10 centimeters deep in the shade of a tree. And this apparently is what tree line species track over time. These very cold temperatures, before and after the growing season, aren't especially damaging to species that have evolved in the cold. They have mechanisms to deal with the cold, as long as it comes on seasonally and not, if it got 40 below in July, that would be a bad thing. But the growing season then is this period when this minus 10 degrees C temperature coincides with the mean weekly temperature of the air of 0 degrees C. That defines the onset of the growing season and similar to the end. And we have this kind of period of time in which growth occurs, meristems are active, photosynthesis occurs, those things that define activity if you're a tree-lined tree. And some of these averages, like in these different places, I'm pointing here, only I can see this, but in Siberia, in Switzerland, in Montana, you see that this average temperature is kind of similar. So Curtis, being the busy hiker that he is, went out with some temperature loggers and climbed up to tree line in 2 mountain ranges in Nevada and put these eye buttons out there. This one place near Mount Moriah in Nevada, eye button location approximately here, and this place, Notch Peak in Utah, eye button approximately here, and measured these same minus 10 centimeter temperature in the soil and found a really similar distribution. So this is the current temperature trend. The tree lives by its assessment of the temperature trend over, say, the last 10,000 years. And so within this as this growing season lengthens, which it would, or as these temperatures exist at higher elevations, that gives an opportunity for the species to migrate upwards. So next on that list were fuels and fire, and maybe you've noticed looking through the surface fuels through these pictures that they're pretty sparse. And while fire is poorly documented in Great Basin Bristlecone pine, I think it's fair to say that we're looking at a low-intensity surface fire over some interval that's probably fairly long. But one of the other influences is the effect of changing snowpack, because the climate people are suggesting that we're going to go from snow to rain, more rain, less snow. So, and we've seen that the last few years. Whether that'll go on, who knows, but less snow, more rain means that we have a shallower snowpack, comes later, melts earlier, and from a fire perspective, what that means to us is its effect on these 1,000-hour fuels. They will dry more rapidly. Some of these things have been laying here decades to centuries. Decomposition just doesn't happen. Conifer forests are the most important biome in the world as far as sequestering carbon, and a lot of it is in here. And the means by which, the rate at which, the timing at which this carbon is released is really important. And so if snowpack becomes limiting 1,000-hour fuels dry, those ignitions that might have been a smoldering surface fire can have a greater intensity, longer residence time, more effect to the system, more effect on the carbon balance. So I think the snow rain thing has some importance in that regard. But everywhere there are fire scars, and that represents the effect of these low intensity surface fires. But like I say, probably just because it's so hard to get there, you guys like Curtis and Andrew, I only hire very high-end hikers, go up there and collect these data. But it's also the reason that maybe data from up there is hard to come by. So another important influence on the fuels fire thing is are the changes that are occurring at the lower elevations in the mixed conifer forest. So if you go up the slope, you find Great Basin Bristlecone pine as a minor cirrus, a major cirrus, and climax. And in this particular photo, you see the line there of dead trees. This is kind of the end of the white fir mixed conifer type, and all that mortality is in white fir. Above that is climax, pure Great Basin Bristlecone pine, and all that grows up into the limestone cliffs is Great Basin Bristlecone pine. And so climate definitely affects those agents of disturbance in firs as well as in the pines. A lot of these talks today have been about what's going on with the PJ down below. Kind of this picture. So skiing down here an avalanche path and looking down slope, if you followed this road out the valley, made a right turn, you'd be in Las Vegas. But down there's the PJ. And so not only are there changes occurring down there that might affect fuels and fire behavior, but also there's a tendency for those same species to start migrating upslope under these same influences. So we have a compression of the mid-elevations, and depending on where the upper alpine tree line is in relation to the height of the mountain determines the maximum extent to which trees can migrate. So we're seeing fuels changes coming up the slope in the same way that the fires will. So these are some data collected by Curtis. Not a lot of really significant differences here, but the trend is pretty obvious. These data collected at 3 elevations, low elevation, mid elevation, high elevation, across standard fuels variables that you're all familiar with, but a general trend towards increasing amounts of those fuels with decreasing elevation. So more fuel down lower, less up higher. But as then we see a migration upward or changes to the forest health or woodland health down low, we could expect to see changes in fuels down low, which might result in the sort of fires that we are beginning to see there. You know, if you look at the records, as best I can determine, there are very few fires documented in Bristlecone pine, and they all tend to be very small. But this Carpenter fire was about 11,000 hectares, started at around 1,800 meters, 35 miles from Las Vegas, and burned well up into the Bristlecone pine type at 3,400 meters. Similarly, the Phillips fire in 2000 started at a lower elevation, and here, obviously, steep slope, southwest facing, wind and dry, and a wind-driven upslope fire through Bristlecone pine, resulting in crown fire where you have very little surface fuel. So there's usually an interaction between surface fire and crown fire, but this was a crown fire that starts down low, and that's the biggest issue, I think, with fuels and fires. What's going on down there, the ignitions that happen down there, and how well they're going to get into the higher elevation pines. Finally, mountain pine beetle. This is all mountain pine beetle mortality, but it's in limber pine. And we observe that it doesn't seem like mountain pine beetle gets in Great Basin bristlecone pine, even though anything you read about it would say, yeah, it's a host. So we went about collecting these volatiles to compare the two species and found, with our associate Justin, the absence of this particular volatile organic compound, 3-carine, in bristlecone pine, but present here in limber pine. Otherwise, a very similar volatile profile, but this major difference accounts for these differences we found in the olfactory response of pedestrian beetles to these odors. And the bolded data over here from Curtis analysis and this paper recently published show where things are significant, and the bottom line is that at least pedestrian beetles in our lab don't smell, if you will, bristlecone pine. They don't consider it to be a host. And that is a really important finding, because that's something that can be eliminated from the disturbance regime cycle, which is really important in most other conifers that we look at, pine species anyway. Here's a big snow avalanche, and right down over here, I'm going to say it, is limber pine attacked by mountain pine beetle. Don't really know when this avalanche was. I would guess 2005. So we're going about studying regeneration in avalanche paths. These little numbers represent places where Curtis and Andrew measured regen. These are the slide paths here by the Las Vegas Ski and Snowboard Resort, the largest snowboard and ski resort in southern Nevada, the only ski and snowboard resort in southern Nevada, but still a true statement. And kind of characteristics of avalanche paths. Big avalanches, maybe 100-year events that result in an abundance of regeneration. So these are FIA plots. A dot over here represents something between dozens to hundreds of seedlings per hectare. So lots of trees. All of these being bristlecone pine, and down here being limber pine, white fir, and aspen. So we regard the snow avalanche as being an important disturbance as far as regeneration goes, versus a comparison looking for seedlings in these two fires that I showed you, where virtually no seedlings can be found. It's a short time since the fires, but we suspect that regeneration in the fires, for whatever reason, is reduced, whereas in snow avalanches, it's abundant. And here finally, for those students who came from my class to listen to this, I always like to talk about how things interact, these interactions of disturbance agents over space especially. Here's the Carpenter Fire. Here's the picture of that avalanche that Curtis took, the panorama. And here's the mountain pine beetle and limber pine. And so it's uncanny how these things tend to occur and interact. And it's largely unknown the extent to which something like this would play out across the mountains of Nevada, but it's intriguing to think about a fire here that removes the overstory that allows snow to be deposited into a starting zone that might create habitat for beetles. But finally then, the IUCN that red lists things considers, and I would agree, bristlecone pine in its current state to be of least concern. I think we further regard that to be true because of the lack of mountain pine beetle activity, the low rates of infection by white pine blister rust, adequate terrain available for migration of species upwards, at least for centuries. There is some concern about snow versus rain and successful regeneration in post-fire, and especially this alteration of the vegetation and forest and woodland health at lower elevations. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening in Logan, Utah. Apparently, we do have time for questions. Yes? Oh. We also are hungry for beer and Mexican food. Yes, Miss Ma'am. Yes. Well, that's a good question. The question is about the brown. I don't know that it was brown or not, but the bar showing a compound present in bristlecone pine that was not present in limber pine, and that particular substance is called methyl salicylate, which is most commonly found in salix, which are willows, acetyl salicylic acid being part of aspirin, so it has this anesthetic property. Some have done studies with hardwoods to show that this is a substance that's emitted when trees are attacked in a way to communicate with other trees, and I'm okay with this kind of concept. Help, I'm being attacked, and this stuff goes out to cause other trees to ramp up their defenses. So maybe this is giant leaps of faith, but maybe beetles are not attacking these trees because they have this response of this substance that's also shown to be antifungal. So it's a fungicide, essentially, an important part of the beetle attack deal with blue stain fungi. So that answer was really well out there, don't you know? Like, what the heck? I think that might be it, Paul.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up then. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.